On the 23rd of January of this new year of ours, President Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Bill into law. So we'll now refer to it as the Expropriation Act. Now, this has numerous implications, economic, politics and policy-wise, for the Constitution, for business operations on the day-to-day business. So a lot for us to try and unpack and uncover. But to start off with, in what will be a series of reports, briefs offered by the Center for Risk Analysis, we start off with, I think, a very good person just to make sense of the whole picture. So in terms of how things are connected, what's the overall approach going forward, it's important in something as momentous as the Expropriation Bill to maybe just take a step back and let's just see what's the state of play. How can we proceed going forward as South Africans, as business people, as concerned citizens who are worried about the country's future and the implications of the Expropriation Bill? So to start off with, we are joined in this particular discussion by Makone Maja, Campaigns Manager at the Institute of Race Relations. Makone, thanks very much for your time here with the CRA. Today, we have a press release released this morning as we record on the 24th of January by the Institute. Just give us maybe some of the key highlights or overviews from the press release, what the Institute is focusing on in terms of the possible impacts of this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It is a sad day for all South Africans. You capture that essence when you speak about ramifications politically, policy-wise, and even on the economy. I think I'd like to lead this conversation by speaking on consequences on civil liberties of South Africans, private citizens across the board. They've just taken a headshot, the biggest assault yet to property rights in South Africa. Property rights, we all know, are the anchor of any democratic society. And so, again, we lament and condemn to the fullest extent the passing of the now Expropriation Act and have tried to fend it off as much as we can over the last decade. And in some ways, the Institute's interventions have improved the legislation, but it would have been better if it had never been signed altogether. Ramifications for private citizens, we capture some of them in our press release as well, where we speak about the fact that expropriation has now increased the size of the government to an enormous extent, enabling it to essentially expropriate property, and in some instances without compensation. There is a list that is provided by the Act, under 12.3 of the Act, of those properties that are vulnerable to nil compensation, effectively no compensation at all. However, there is a caveat in the Act itself stating that this list is open-ended. It's an inexhaustible list. So whilst there are various properties that are targeted by expropriation without compensation, it's not limited to those ones specifically. Others can still be read into that. So the scope is wide and it's vague. And despite some of the commentary I've heard from various political analysts on this, suggesting that the bill now brings about clarity for investors, so they know that there are certain properties that are ring-fenced for expropriation without compensation. That's unfortunately not true. There are so many inferences, so many dangers that are baked into the bill owing to vagueness and opaqueness. Just to speak on one of the ways in which private citizens particularly are targeted by the bill is when we make mention of the fact that the definition of the expropriation under the now Expropriation Act excludes custodial takings, right? So typically expropriation means that compensation is guaranteed, although the Act does make provisions for exceptions where expropriation can go without being compensated for. However, by not excluding custodial takings where the government takes control, right, rather than ownership, takes control of possession of property, including homes of private citizens, farms or factories, or even just barren land that somebody is holding on to, those custodial takings can occur where the government takes control over that property and effectively do it in perpetuity. So you are deprived of access to land that you once owned or held or were in possession of, and still have to pay whatever loan facility that you took out to pay for that loan. So if you ask me, various assaults on various fronts in terms of civil liberties, the administrative rights of South Africans are diminished greatly by this piece of law, including up to and including how and when they should approach the courts. These are all things that the IRR had mentioned in our petition to the president, which we had sent him in April of 2024, urging him to not sign the bill. And yet today we sit with the bill inked, now act signed into law.
Just in the wider context of doing business in South Africa and our macro policy space. So that space is informed by various things in the economic sector and healthcare, infrastructure. So this is, of course, pertaining to property. As you mentioned, one of those key ingredients for societies that have high economic growth rates, better average quality of life. There's no way that's perfect. And any politician who tells you that their country is perfect, I think you should ask questions about in general. That's a good rule of thumb, I think. But just in terms of having that essential ingredient of strengthening property rights, this comes in the context of the broader policy space where President Ramaphosa, at talking to Davos, talks about South Africa's investment climate and that South Africa is open to business and doing business. And you've had utterances over the last year or so that the government wants to turn the country into one massive construction site. That requires investing serious capital, whether it's in construction, manufacturing. You invest in assets that you can't take out of a country overnight. And in our assessment, what the Expropriation Act does, it just raises another flag for investors, both local and international, as to why they should invest in South Africa. Just drill down for us a bit into the sort of investment risk aspects of the Expropriation Act.
Well, it's really quite simple. For any society to thrive or create conditions for investment and investor-friendly or investor-conducive environment, essentially, in government through policy, they cannot ignore property rights because, as you've mentioned, once you start drilling into a country or building roads or building bridges or building factories, right, you need security that the government is not going to overnight just take control of that building, that factory, that bridge that you built, or the railway or transmission lines, which have also been in discussion about like privatizing transmission lines for solar energy. And so the government pays lip service to the issue of investment, but perhaps they actually don't know how to generate investment so that we can get on a path to growth, because this is certainly the opposite of how you achieve it. And we make that statement based on a few things. One is, think of this, Chris, virtually every survey, every barometer that rates or ranks democracies across countries always value one thing as the greatest and most important, and that's rule of law, which is effectively property rights. We've just lost that, right? The second thing is that I want to point out this, that the president making statements and trying to attract investment in Davos. Davos is also the home of the World Economic Forum, where we were promised that we will own nothing and be happy. I'd say that's the path we're on. The Expropriation Act creates a warm environment for that sort of reality to be made manifest, right? Where we're increasingly chipping away at property rights of South Africans. So South Africa is not immune to those set of circumstances that need to be created and that have been created by countries that have successfully grown over the years and growth exponentially in a short period of time, as we would like to. But again, that dream of growth and that dream of investment, that dream of seeing construction and yellow trucks everywhere has now been deferred with the single stroke of a signature on this act.
Makone, two more questions before we wrap up. Second to last question, specifically just on the risks to the GNU, and these permutations I think are quite numerous. From one perspective, it appears that this particular kind of legislation goes against the spirit of intent, the statement of intent of the formation of the GNU. So both the letter and the spirit of it, in terms of the president and his party acting unilaterally. I'm not going to ask you to maybe try and predict, let's say by Monday, the current constellation of the GNU isn't there anymore. But just what this says maybe around, policy making and maybe for the ANC as well, despite it dropping from 50% to from above 50% to 40% in the last elections, still not that realization that it is a partner in a governing coalition.
I think we need to confront the reality that is that the spirit of the GNU has been one of unilateral action by the ANC, right? Whether this was the increase of cabinet and the rest of the non-ANC GNU members not being made aware of, whether or not there would be more cabinet positions for them to also be offered, or this bill, which seems to have come at a surprise to the Minister of Public Works, who would have to administer over it. Similar thing happened with the Bella. So I do think this is effectively the spirit of the GNU, right? That the ANC would be non-consultative with its partners, which tells us how much the ANC actually values the GNU partners, because this is not how the ANC used to do business with its tripartite alliance members, the SACP and COSATU. They were always involved, whether it was in the appointment of ministers or tabling of legislation. In fact, you'll remember, Chris, that often you'd have to wait a few more hours for a minister to be announced because the president was still consulting members of the tripartite alliance. So just the ANC knows how to work collaboratively. They're actively choosing not to collaborate with the people who are keeping them in a majority government. And so, yeah, this is effective. This is the spirit of the GNU, just the ANC continuing to act as though they have majority.
Makone, a final question, spotlighting and highlighting the work that the Institute has been doing for years now on this broader issue of expropriation without compensation. It's not just about the expropriation bill. There are various other pieces of legislation that in the bigger picture steadily undermine and dilute South Africans' property rights as they are even just discussed, never mind implemented. Even the threat of seizure without compensation threatens investments and property rights. But just the work that the Institute is endeavoring to do now on this going forward, presuming it would include things like legal action as well, but just give people an idea of where they can find out more, how they can support the work that the Institute does.
Yeah, listen, I think the GNU has taught us just and demonstrated to the rest of the country something that the IR has always known. We've been around for almost 100 years now. It's just how hard it is to influence government. This was the case under apartheid when the Institute was defending, the rights of the individual over an ever-increasing government. It's the same now in post-democratic South Africa. It's still very hard to influence government. And so this is one way in which we've been able to defer the signing of this act as far as possible, because the president did acknowledge receipt of our petition, where we bring about the substantive and procedural elements that we found unconstitutional within the act, and he thanked us for them, actually. There are other ways in which we've managed to soften the blow in terms of the exceptions made on the expropriation without compensation clause. So the Institute has demonstrably been able to somehow manage to influence government, although we could still do more. And one of the ways in which we want to do that is to challenge this act in a court of law, to defend the rights of South Africans and to defend constitutionalism, which the GNU is supposed to be a coalition that's pro the Constitution. It clearly isn't. The ANC is now speaking outrightly about appending Section 25 and actually calling on progressive entities within the National Assembly to join it in again torpedoing of Section 25 of the Constitution. We call on regular South Africans, all South Africans, businesses, private individuals as well, private citizens as well, to support the Institute. On our website, there's a support button there. You can donate any amount to us. We'd be most grateful for us. That will enable us to, again, challenge this in court and to defend, again, the rights of citizens against a government that just is power hungry and seems to know no end in terms of centralizing its own power. and giving itself more and more strength in facing up against ordinary civilians.
Given the barrage that we often get of bad policy and bad ideas, bad legislation, it becomes, as individual citizens, it becomes difficult to know what to do, what you can do. So many South Africans, we see it in our polling, how much they want to make a positive difference. And I think supporting an organization like the Institute of Race Relations is one way for you as a concerned but active and responsibility-taking South African citizen to ensure that you do what is within your power to influence policy. The Institute will use various avenues wherever possible, engaging those parties in the GNU that do respect property rights, the rule of law, to support them and individuals in those parties where possible, and also then in the court of public opinion, as well as likely where possible some legal routes. So with that in mind, as Makone mentioned, and we can't stress that enough, please consider finding out more about the Institute and supporting our work wherever possible. Well, on that note, Makone, thank you very much. I'm sure there will be much more to come from this, and we'll keep our clients and everyone abreast of the developments and the issues that the CRA and the Institute provide in terms of our analysis and our public campaigns. Thank you very much for watching. The Center for Risk Analysis will be publishing a range of risk alerts, client briefings, as well as other reports on the implications, political as well as economic, of the signing into law of the Expropriation Act. To have access to all of our reports, as well as our ad hoc query research service and all of our briefings, become a CRA premium client today. Click on the link below. Thank you.